Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this two-part series of seminars on critical collapsology with instructor Richard Hames. So, as Richard wrote in the description of the seminar, this is again the second installment of a two-part series. In the first part of this seminar, we established a new frame for studying the rapid decomposition of social structure, which we called critical collapsology. This theory conceptualizes more adequately the vulnerabilities faced by global capitalist societies and sketches an orientation toward collapse. However, this theory still remains relatively abstract. So during this second part, we will look at the particular histories that have led us to our vulnerable present moment and develop a radical politics adequate to our incapacity for formulating utopias. How did the world become so vulnerable? How have people responded to vulnerability before? Why is the end of a utopia a problem for the left? What institutions should we create now and how? This first week, we will run a collective mapping project to enumerate our current risks. We will introduce the horizon scanning techniques, the Delphi method, and the basic principles and theory of prediction markets. Richard Hames is a political theorist and journalist. He is the co-author of Post-Internet Far Right and the Rise of Ecofascism, Climate Change, and the Far Right. He is also an editor of Crude Futures, as well as a host of Novara FM and its series producer. Before all that, he was a composer and founder of contemporary music group Ensemble XY. He's currently working on a book project on collapse. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuval, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm really happy to see so many of you here, so many familiar faces. I'm also really happy to see people who didn't come to the first session. There will be a sort of recap. As people who came to the first session will know, we left the last seminar on something of a cliffhanger, which is that I said, here is my theory of collapse. And now after having talked for 10 hours, I have half an hour to explain it to you. And so we got sort of almost there into the theory. I gave a sketch. We will do something much more thorough today. One of the readings that I set as well for this topic, this seminar, was the thing called Our Theory of Collapse, which went out on this Substack that you probably read. I'll be talking through that theory, and then we'll be trying to apply it to various kinds of recent events to think about how that theory fails or succeeds at describing those events. And as Yuval just mentioned, we'll be trying to move from the very abstract theory that I gave there into something more concrete. Does the theory still work when we move from these abstractions to this concretion, or do local specifics of every given case kind of overwhelm the theory, right? Do they mean that actually at the abstract level it doesn't say much of anything, right? That's entirely possible. And I'd like to have that as a sort of conversation that we're discussing together, rather than me simply telling you that the thing is or isn't sufficiently abstract or well organized. We're going to be starting with a sort of a general redo of the previous seminar. I'll tell you what happened, because everyone needs to remember, right? Rather than just people who are new. I should also say that I wrote that description a while ago, so we won't actually be covering prediction markets this time. If you're interested in prediction markets, we can talk about it, but that's not explicitly what I'm going to be talking about today. So here we are, the Collapsology Part 2, Limitless Risk, the politics of limitless risk. And I'll be talking a bit later about what that means. So what happened? We had 4 seminars back in April sometime, can't remember exactly when. And we went through 4 sessions, right? So the first thing that we talked about was what I call traditional collapsology. So traditional collapsology is a sort of comparative sociology. Sometimes it's not particularly comparative even. Sometimes it's just sociology of a single case of a society that has fallen apart. The Roman Empire is the canonical example here, but you can also think about a whole collection of other examples. People often talk about Rapa Nui, which is we call Easter Island in English. this is an example of a society that seems to sort of fall apart. The question is, why did that happen, right? And the traditional collapsology approach, I sort of faulted. We went through a bunch of different theories. There's, of course, Spengler, there's Gibbon, there's a whole bunch of other kind of theorists in there. I'm not going to go through all of them because that'll be just doing the seminar again. And then I sort of faulted this on a couple of bases, right? One, I said that it doesn't really have sort of strong predictive capacity. That is, it doesn't really tell you what might happen to the society we currently live in. And ultimately, the kind of thing we care about when we're thinking about the past is really the present and our immediate future. Right? We care about things that are real and tangible to us in our lives, the collapse of our own societies, the collapse of societies around the world to which we relate and care about. So that's really what the problem of traditional collapsology is that it doesn't allow us a way of expressing that kind of deep involvement with the subject, right? But also it lacks, and this is my other claim, it lacks a robust theory of social structure. Why is it that societies not only fall apart, why do they stay together? Like, why is collapse so rare as an event in the whole of human history? Why is it much more normal for things to transition, perhaps with lots of violence, but nevertheless transition into new kinds of societies? And why do the everyday practice of life, why is that so robust, right? And to try and understand that from the perspective of theory as well. In the second seminar, I went through what I described as the recent advances in existential risk studies. So existential risk is a domain that deals not explicitly or exclusively with collapse, but instead looks at a whole collection of much broader transformations, which involve everyone dying, like not just a society falling apart, but in fact sort of universal obliteration. So the classic example here is, of course, nuclear war and the following of that by nuclear winter, right, which destroys agriculture, degrades societies. People, will be familiar with some of the 20th century canon of these things. So there's a very famous film called Threads, which is about the post-apocalyptic kind of environment. It's also, The Road and so on. Like, again, post-apocalyptic literatures focus on these kind of maximal disaster cases. And that's really what existential risk studies as well. More recently than nuclear war, there's been a lot of concern about AI, right? AI as a kind of universal optimizer that optimizes for something that is non-human values. And so it ends up destroying us or killing us, not for reasons of aggression, that it hates us, or in the kind of classic like Terminator version, but for reasons that we are simply made of atoms that could be used for something else. This is Elias Yudkowsky's formulation. And we talked a lot about those kinds of sci-fi worlds. And that's not a term I use disparagingly. I'm not against sci-fi. I just think that like they're kind of essentially drawing on a bunch of tropes from that sort of universe. And we talked a bit about the way in which those kinds of things bleed into and change into relatively quotidian concerns about stock market prices and falling birth rates and so on, right? These kind of things get processed into a much more grounded and in some ways much more sort of insidious discipline that I call reactionary civilizationism. If you're interested in this, I wrote a blog post about that. It's called the Collapse Culture, or Welcome to the Age of Collapse Culture. The third session is where things start to take quite like a major departure from traditional collapsology. I mentioned earlier that the canonical example here is the Roman Empire. And of course, there is an aspect of conquest involved in that, right? The Ostrogoths and Visigoths and so on invade the Western Roman Empire. But in some ways, the consideration of the ways in which our contemporary global society has forced the collapse of other societies worldwide is given scant attention in the literature. So there we talked about a text by Nick Estes called Our History is the Future, and which is written from a sort of indigenous American perspective about the sort of destruction of the world of the indigenous Americans through counterinsurgency techniques pioneered by the American army and the process of sort of world destruction and the cosmological disintegration of that world. And so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to understand the ways in which the metabolism of contemporary society, of contemporary sort of global capitalist society, not only involves moments of productive growth, which are then threatened by collapse risk, often which comes in the literature externally supervolcanoes, asteroids, and so on. But to reframe that metabolism in terms that mean that the way in which that society grows itself entail destruction elsewhere, and also entail a sort of internal violence that persists under the surface of that society. And sometimes not under the surface, right? Like very visibly. And so that's the point of applying collapsology as a framework. How are societies broken apart deliberately as part of the overall social metabolism? And then in the fourth seminar, I introduced critical collapsology, which is a kind of framework that understands this pathological relationship that contemporary society has to growth, to organization of its world, that tries to locate inside the ongoing capitalist process moments of destruction that seem like they are collapses, but that actually in the long arc of history produce a greater form of robustness. And so in order to do that, in order to understand that sort of social metabolism, the process that we had to do was to think about the ways in which we construct institutions that compress, displace, and complexify the world in a way that ultimately leads to pathological outcomes, right? But that is robust. So robust and pathological become the same thing. Although there is a sort of ratio we can think about here between the ways in which institutions construct clean, well-organized, smooth functioning worlds for their agents, and the ways in which they ultimately destroy other forms of living, or indeed end up destroying the preconditions for their own forms of living. Lots of sort of contradictions here we could talk about. James O'Connor did a very interesting, wrote an interesting article on this called The Second Contradiction of Capitalism, the ways in which capitalism undermines its own ecological basis. And we'll talk a bit today about Jason Moore, who has tried to expand that into his theory of the cheaps. You may have come across a very popular book he wrote with Raj Patel called The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, which is about cheap inputs of labor, land, energy, food, and so on. Cheap care as well. I can't remember what the other 2 are, but like that's the sort of the broader framework. Jason Moore talks about 4 cheap things, which I've just named the 4. So where are we, right? Where are we in this kind of a particular kind of moment? I've written here a sort of impressionistic collection of things that you might consider when we're thinking about the construction of a particular collapsed culture, and that give fodder to that imaginary that says, well, the world is destined for a kind of disaster. These are points overwhelmingly where some very fragile thing that we thought would have sort of broader consequences, that we thought was sort of broadly robust, breaks, and therefore breaks a whole collection of other systems simultaneously. So we might think about, for example, this central example here that I don't know if you see on a mouse, but I'm pointing at it. We have cybersecurity software widely adopted as a box-checking exercise. Breaks on a single update, rendering millions of computer systems worldwide unusable. People remember this? It's about 2 or 3 years ago. Basically, there was a cybersecurity system that everyone had just adopted as the standard, and then it got updated, and it ended up breaking all of the Windows computers basically simultaneously. And it took a long time to fix because it was very difficult to fix computers without computers. And so, that took a very long time. Millions of flights, not millions, tens of thousands of flights were cancelled. Millions of people were left unable to work and do things. It's a very classic example of the kind of fragility and robustness simultaneously of the contemporary world. You might also say, well, it didn't really make any difference, right? It was sort of 24 hours of outages, right? It wasn't really a kind of a long-term transformation. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. There's a relative scale to these different things. Other things are much more substantial in here, right? Other things are much more sort of wide-scale movements. The far right rising is undoubtedly the main geopolitical story of the last 10 years. That's a really strange development in some ways, but it's also sort of explicable, I think, in terms of this framework. And we'll talk a bit about like why that framework, I think, kind of makes sense inside this sort of institutional framework that I'm suggesting. I mentioned this already, but we're going to be using a thing called polis throughout this seminar, and then throughout the next sessions as well. I would like you to open this link, which I'm now going to send in the chat. If I can find out where the chat is. So please open this link. What you will find there, and I hope this is obvious, people, what you will find there is a thing that I put my sort of suggestions for collapse drivers into. You should be able to see, if you click on that link, the thing I was showing you earlier, which is this collapse drivers thing. I'm going to talk through it one more time just because we didn't know everyone was here. What I want you to do is I want you to look at the kind of collapse drivers that I've already written in there. I want you to log in, first of all. Sorry, I should have said that. I want you to log in. I'll give you 1 minute to log in, and then because you can use a Google account or something, so you just click on sign in with Google. It seems to work. And just give me a quick hands up when you've logged in. You don't see a login. Okay. Okay. If you go to, oh, you already logged in. Do you have an account? No. The reason why I want people to log in is because you can see down here it says the visualization will appear once 7 participants have begun voting. And I don't know if it gives you like a clear sense of, I don't know if it tracks who you are if you're not logged in. If you can already add things, then I'm very happy for you to do that without logging in. But I would prefer at least 7 people need to log in so we can see this visualization. So if you can do, please do. If you can't, if you need to log in, then maybe just go to the main site, which is pol.is. I'll write that again. There it is. Sensi, you're logged in? Great. Anyone else give me a thumbs up when you're logged in? Yeah, Melissa's logged in. Yeah, Benjamin? Oh, you're logged in. There was a thumbs. Okay. Click on the big P. Thank you very much. That's good, useful, Sabi. There's a big P at the bottom. Click on there. Joel? Was that a thumbs up or was that a hands up?
Sorry, it was a thumbs up.
Thumbs up. Great. Okay, cool. So I think some number of people should be logged in. And what we're going to do here, I want you to carry on doing this through while I'm talking as well. So if I make a point and you're like, that doesn't make any sense, write the opposite or write a more nuanced take inside this box, share your perspective. And what you're doing there is you're making a new statement, right? A new statement that will be reflected in the overall collection of statements. So can someone add one? Interesting. Someone has written, that's accelerationism, right? I think that's dangerous. So thank you for adding something in. However, it's not the thing you're trying to do is not a comment. So you're trying to make a new statement, right? You're trying to make a new, completely standalone statement that I will now see. So you can see on my screen, I've got a thing that says, that's accelerationism, right? I think it's dangerous. I don't know what that means because yeah, so that's fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that one out. I'm going to edit that so I can moderate here. I'm going to reject that one. I've also rejected my own one, but I want people to add things that they think are more. Yes, so what you're trying to do is you're trying to come up with a more nuanced take than the one in the thing, right? So you could say something like, and the idea is that over a time we converge towards a collection of nuanced statements we agree with, right? That express the ambivalence, that express the complexity of the topic, rather than simply commenting on what each person says. So, natural crises, cascade through economies. Can someone add a comment so I can? Okay, unmoderated. Great. So we've got one here. All right. So 3 statements here. People have added. Great. Thank you so much. The collapse of institutional robustness within religion is transferring such robustness onto technological industries. I think this was Senza. It was Senza. Yes, I've read your submission to the previous course. I was like, okay, this is definitely it. Excellent. Accept. I'm not accepting these because I think they're true. I'm accepting them because I think they're valid statements in the kind of the game that we're playing, right? Centralized organizations are authoritarian. Collapse of the old kind of world is certain. Add some more, and I will keep thinking. So what I want to do is go through the ones that are already there as well. Not all of them, because it's a lot of them, but I want you to look at these different things that as they make sense. I will periodically come back. I will approve statements in the moderator panel. Aha! And now you can see at the bottom, this is what we wanted. Now you can see as people answer statements, we'll be put into cluster groups. And this is the overall point of the exercise. We're put into cluster groups where we can see who agrees with who, how the different clusters of opinion are emerging. So people who are on the one side are essentially, well, I'm not going to try and pre-guess what the clusters are going to be, but I think, aha, something happened there. So keep going, and we will see. So these things are expressing degree of approval. So people in the A cluster. All right, it's going, but it might take a while for me to work out. Everyone did this. Okay, thank you so much. Keep going. I'm going to now give the lecture, and while I'm doing that, I want people to add things to getting some very interesting shapes here. All right, let's keep going with the lecture itself, and then I will talk through this. Can you still see my slides? Yeah. Great. Okay, cool. So what is the theory of collapse that I'm proposing? The theory of collapse starts from a theory of institutions. It starts from the idea that we have a selection of ways of organizing the world that produce compressions, displacements of complexity, and then also complexify in new ways. And so we end up with a cycle. We have a collection of institutions that are designed to make the world more simple for us. So for example, we might think about food systems as a classic example here. The world becomes more simple because we can impose homogeneity onto food systems. So before we had very complicated food systems, lots of small parcelized farms. And now we have very large farms that are organized around a single crop, right? So we have cash cropping. And what this does is produce a compression of complexity into a single area, into a single system that then facilitates people living with much more food in the long run, right? That's the simple notion of what compression does. You can also think about another classic institution here, which is educational systems. Feel free to ask questions at any point if you're wondering what I'm doing. We also have another example is the educational systems. Education systems take the wide, complex heterogeneity of the kinds of things that children are, and they compress them into children that have a set of definite and well-defined skills. Right? We organize the heterogeneity of children into a sort of relatively conventional, well-organized collection of people, adults, all of us, who can then have a set of skills. We can all read, we can all write, we can all have certain social skills. We have certain kinds of ways of relating to the world. And this process of compression is sort of the fundamental process of human organizational function. So another example is identity, right? We all have legally defined identities that allow the state to interact with us as if we are a single coherent human whole. We also have, kind of other kind of ideological compressions. We say, well, we are all forms of a single nationality. We are all kinds of people who are oriented towards a single set of interests. And so there is a kind of an abstraction here of what compression means in this theory. Let's think about farming again, right? So what the production of homogeneous farming does, which is the main story of the 19th and 20th century in some way, what that construction of compressed farming or homogeneous farming does is also mean that people are dependent on people to buy their crops, right? You can't eat all the wheat in your field, and you wouldn't want to. It's just wheat. You have to sell it. And so you displace your organization of social structure onto someone else, the market, right? Which then facilitates the trading and the organization of that at a larger scale. If you think this is incredibly basic, you're probably right. But it's supposed to be a sort of very fundamental theory of how it is that organizations work. And so the forms of compression that we organize entail forms of displacement. We move from compression to displacement. This is a necessary moment of the organization of the world, or in this particular kind of mode. However, at the same time, that displacement of the act of farming into a sort of that gets mediated through money, mediated through markets and so on, also produces a new form of complexity, right? A new form of complexity then emerges, which is technological competition. My farm produces more wheat than your farm, and so on, but also produces new kinds of new complexification inside us as people. So we begin to want more things. We begin to want more and more complex collections of things from the market. And so you end up with the sort of consumer culture after many, many, many cycles of this. You end up with kind of consumer culture where my demands are basically unlimited, right? Where we have a kind of like a collection of things that I want that are incredibly specific, which are facilitated by this process of massive compression, the displacement of needs onto a market, and then the complexification of needs within that market. And this is sort of the basic cycle that I see as sort of underlining the organization of the world. Does anyone disagree with this? Or have like a different way of formulating this kind of process that they think is sort of worthwhile? Senza, was that a nod?
No, I rather wanted to ask you. Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good.
I wanted to ask you just upon that point of organization, which in the text is referred initially as organization and then has compression, precisely because compression is a way of organizing, right? And just to make things, just to get it clear in my head. So you're saying that in this first function, heterogeneity is not only um, assimilated in a way, but it's also acknowledged. Like it's not looking to be suppressed, right? Like that's the idea of the production of complexities, correct?
So at the initial stage, at the initial sort of moment of the construction of the institution, heterogeneity begins to be compressed or suppressed or pushed away. So one very sort of understandable and quite sympathetic version of this is that nature has loads of pests, right? Nature has loads of viruses. Nature has loads of forms of blight that can affect a certain crop. And the purpose of a certain mode of farming is to suppress or compress that and move away that complexity. To say that instead of this vast heterogeneity that nature itself sort of represents, we will deal only with the simplified version of it. And so it's a kind of purification process, but one that I'm not, there's no moral valence here. I'm not saying it's bad.
Yeah, no. Just wanted to get it clear since you linked these two notions of organization and compression as the same thing. But
yes.
Yeah, no, I get it.
So
thank you.
The compression process, the more sort of like the controversial perhaps thing here perhaps is that I'm claiming that all three steps, compression, displacement, complexification, all entail are all forms of organization, right? They're all organizational functions.
Okay. Yes.
But the first one is compression, the second one is displacement, and the third one is complexification. And so we end up in a process of increasing complexity, despite the fact that what we've tried to do is to compress and organize the world in a simplifying way. And so what I'm trying to do here, and this is not evidence, people, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take Joseph Tainter's basic theory, which we talked about in the first session of last time, right? Or maybe the second session, in which Joseph Tainter rightly notes that over time there is increased complexity of social structure, and says, well, eventually that will run out of energy. Right? This is Tainter's model. Eventually that will run out of energy, and we will get declining rates of return on energy invested, EROI, energy return on energy invested, EROI. And as that EROI declines, we will no longer be able to service or maintain the social structure that we have come to expect. And that means that we enter a period of collapse. And so there's this model where we go up and then we go down. Go on, Tenzo.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, okay.
So
And
we
so
go once again to the idea of the collapse as a thing within the model, not like something outside.
exactly.
Like, yeah, it's
Yes.
not an alien. It's not an alien variable. It's like rather inside of the same appreciation and development.
Exactly. So I'm trying to internalize the process of collapse, to say that it exists within the process of the construction of the model itself. That social complexity is a reduction, the social complexity at the large scale is facilitated by local simplification. And so our whole process by which we move towards a more complex society consists of thousands of moments, millions of moments, at which the world becomes more simple for us. And so, in distinction to Tainter, I think that technology doesn't produce complexification. I think technology produces forms of simplification, but at the cost of an aggregate total social complexity. And so you have this relationship between the agent, the single person who experiences the society, and the single person experiencing society. Their life becomes simpler in the short run, at the cost of overall aggregate complexity increasing. And so you have two different variables, right? My complexity, the social complexity. And I think Tainter misses this.
Okay.
Amin, you've written, sounds like algorithmic realism.
Sounds like to me at least, the travel and salesman's paradox would have to optimize distribution routes, which, given the realism part of it, I think you have mentioned that is dependent on locality. So definitely with the realism aspect, I would definitely see it as local collapse in referential terms.
Yeah, so the thing is that like inside the overall process of construction of simplification, there are thousands and thousands of moments at which we enter into local collapses, but that's part of the metabolism of the overall thing. I don't know enough about algorithmic realism to comment on that specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. It did sound like metabolism process.
Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. And so the claim here is that we enter into a sort of cycle, and that cycle endlessly expands. We will go on in a moment to try and clarify this in terms of Jason Moore's argument that he makes in his text about the commodity frontier and the way in which capitalism moderates the commodity frontier with the virtue of, by virtue of enormous sort of free inputs or cheap inputs beyond it. So the reason why our simplified agriculture can work is because there is enough nitrogen in the soil already, right? And so there is a sort of process in which this process of complex simplification that I'm outlining here relies on a pre-existing heterogeneity in nature. It relies on a pre-existing kind of bounty of nature, which then capitalism can appropriate as a cheap. And so by moving by sort of changing that frontier of where we are in capitalism, where capitalism is expanded to, we enter into a process that allows for those things to be absorbed into the market, but at the cost of the reduction of their sort of naturalized bounty, right? And at the cost of having to pay for them, right? And that's why that's where Jason Moore locates a crisis of cheap nature. As society expands, as society kind of accommodates more and more and more of nature, it enters into a crisis because it actually, in fact, turns out not to be able to pay for the things that it is appropriating, right? So appropriation is a natural and necessary part of the capitalist dynamic, as opposed to merely exploitation, which is the value theory, of course, of Marx. Okay. Lots of things to consider. perhaps too many things to consider. Does it work in practice? Right? Like, what kinds of things does it actually explain? Because it sounds very abstract, and I think it sounds partly a bit uncontroversial. I think it also sounds maybe a little bit, and this is a question that I'm kind of asking myself endlessly, it sounds kind of unfalsifiable. Like, how would I know if it's not true? How would I find a case where this cycle doesn't happen? So that's one question. So is it just like a kind of description, right? Is it not really a theory in that sense, and it doesn't make predictive kind of statements about the world? So let's think about the Green Revolution, which is the example I went through last time. So I'm going to go through it again, but we're going to think about it in sort of in these detailed terms. This development of input-intensive monocultural agriculture is enabled by global fertilizer flows, right? So we get the guano, the Haber-Bosch process, and so on. Haber-Bosch process is the process of constructing synthetic nitrogen from the air. Nitrogen's all around us. It's most of the air. And yet we need it in the soil in a sort of form that it can be eaten by plants, right? And yet we didn't have a process until Haber-Bosch did this in the early 20th century. We didn't have a process for like moving these things into the ground. That's what that does. I then think it's possible to think about the Green Revolution, which happens from the 50s until the 80s, as and then Raj Patel has a really good article called The Long Green Revolution, which people should check out. I didn't put it on the reading list, but it's great. This process of constructing an institution, and here again, I'm using institution in a very broad way, right, as a kind of a non-necessary, not social category, but as a kind of general category of like how machines or things operate. In this case, wheat, right? The construction of drought-resistant semi-dwarf wheat, which sounds very technical, but it is just like a kind of wheat, that Norman Borlaug pioneers, allows for this kind of state space to become more capacious. So things can happen to the wheat and doesn't fall apart. And in that sense, the wheat becomes cheaper over time because it requires less human input. But that's a displacement activity, right? It displaces the process onto the outside world. And so we've entered from our simplification or our compression into our second stage, displacement, and then we necessarily move towards something like complexification as well, as the kinds of technologies of farming that lock in as we need more and more fertilizer, right? So again, compression, displacement, and so on. As it says here, this is supposed to be contradicting earlier energy determinist collapse theories like Joseph Tainter's, because I don't think that all technologies require greater inputs, right? That's the question. This happens in the Green Revolution. We expand food output, and then we nationalize institutions, I've already mentioned. This means, as I've sort of gone through, farmers become structurally dependent on fertilizers, on machinery, on volatile food markets, and they get subsumed at a new level of abstraction into another form of compression, which is the law of one price. Do people know what the law of one price is? The law of one price is a way of expressing what Marx calls the law of value, which is that on the market, all things must be traded at like a single price, right? Because like everyone converges onto a single price. All these heterogeneous producers, all these ways of life, all these different kind of varieties of forms become expressed on the market simply as a moderate, in the form of a single price. And ultimately, and this is Marx's sort of grand systematic claim, ultimately the whole of the process of production, the whole of the process of life becomes subsumed into a single form of expression, which is the expression of commodities for exchange on markets at a single price, right? And that is the process of compression. All of life gets drawn into this. And so we move from a sort of what looked like a great idea, which is to organize farming in a better way, into a system in which the whole of social life has to submit to a single price, a single law of social organization, right? And that, I think, is the thing that I'm trying to express in institutional theory. Nevertheless, there are all these forms of externality that get kind of expressed that produce further complexity, topsoil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and then people have to move to the cities. And this sets the stage for the thing that we talked about again last time, which is Paul Ehrlich's famous book, The Population Bomb, 1968, where he's sitting in a car in India and he observes this huge number of people who seem like they are very poorly provisioned, who seem like they're very poor and they are begging for money from him. And he says, well, this is a sort of a naturalized consequence of people being profligate, having too many children, and so on. And he talks about it in sort of essentially colonial language. But really what's happened here, underlying this, is that people have been ejected from the farms, moved to the cities, because the process of the Green Industrial Revolution has produced such sort of efficiencies, quote unquote, in farming that labor is no longer required. And so we end up with this kind of mass centralization around cities, right? That's the sort of complexification that comes after this process of compression. And so all these things sort of tied together. And then, of course, in the cities, what do people have to do? They have to work in ways that are basically commoditized. And that commoditization, like they have to sell their labor power on the market. And that commoditization entails a certain kind of compression. Again, so the cycle continues. All right. So here I said, everyone becomes more and more subject to the organization of production for value. Political control deepens as complex societies demand further centralized regulation. This is another feature of this. You get a much more powerful state. And then there are the kind of ideological aspects. So it's very clear the Green Revolution is motivated in part by anti-communism. There is a great worry that the Soviet Union, which is relatively close to India at this point, or indeed China, might do developmentalism better than the capitalists can, right? And so there's this great sort of geopolitical competition between the Soviet bloc and the West for this process of humanitarianism, and sort of the question about how the what is called at that time the third world, right? As in not the world of the capitalist bloc or not the world of the Soviet Union, right? How that world will be sort of organized and how it will be provisioned. And so this produces new forms of resistance, new forms of solidarity among exploited groups, and this forms a new kind of compression. And so the cycle continues, right? So at every stage, compression, displacement, complexification, compression, displacement, complexification, so on, so on, so on. How do things fail? How do things fall apart? This is really the question we're trying to answer, right? So the thing that I've told you before already is that we have the systems are sort of organized, right? The question is, how do they fall apart? Because that's really the question of collapse. The first level, and this is again goes back to what Amin and Senzo were talking about there, with this sort of localized or relativistic framework of like from a particular point of a single actor, what do things look like? We enter into a small scale market disruption. My farm is gone. I am no longer employed by the farm that I was employed by, right? These are forms of destruction. At the same time, they're also forms of the sort of construction of a new world, right? So we enter a market disruption, or like an individual state function failure would be a good another example of this sort of low level. Like this hospital didn't do the thing it's supposed to do, or this education institution didn't do the thing it's supposed to do, or it would collapse and so on. The question is whether or not that sort of overall localized destruction contributes to a broader metabolism. That's the kind of the overall question here. That's scale one. That's sort of that's the smallest scale. It often seems like destruction or like collapse to us. It's certainly destructive. The question is whether or not it's part of a metabolism. We can then talk about institutional composition shifts. So dynamics in a sort of polycrisis moment. We're currently in a polycrisis, as often claimed by people like Adam Tooze. We were in a polycrisis in the 70s in Western Europe, in America. That's how we got to Reagan, Thatcher, a whole collection of other sort of neoliberal revolutions. We can shift forms of institutional forms, shift into new compositions of those forms. We might also think about generalized state failure. So when I talk about the post-Cold War era in a moment, I'm going to be talking about like the former Yugoslavia. The other example that kind of springs to mind is Somalia, which often I think forms something of a kind of imaginary of what we think collapse might be like, right? Even though it's actually a very, very different society to the ones that most of us live in. And so these are kind of relatively localized failures. They're very extreme failures, but they are localized failures. The question of collapse then is this sort of step above, right? It's the question of like, can a institutional composition that organizes the world be found? If no, then that's when we enter into collapse. And so it's these sort of three broad stages: institutional failures, compositional shifts, and then collapse as a whole thing. And in that process, we might think about the ways in which institutional functions are rapidly disencapsulated, So what I mean by disencapsulation is that the process of the construction of a very complex system, let's say hospitals, right, that although they are very particular kinds of things, or health systems, although they're very particular things, very particular kind of localized technologies in some ways, produce effects across the whole of the society that allow for the whole society to grow. And so we get this kind of compression, and then that facilitates a broader social dynamism, which spills, and then when those systems end, like if you imagine that no one could go to a hospital, then they spill that complexity back over the social whole. People have to be cared for at home, diseases spread, forms of things that could be very easily treated can't be treated anymore. And you see this at various stages in the modern world, right? Like, there is a crisis, particularly famously in America, where people delay going to the hospital for a long period of time because it's expensive. And then when they get there, they're actually much sicker than they would have been if they'd gone at the right time. And therefore it's more expensive. And so you get this kind of this perverse dynamic of healthcare. Clearly the healthcare system in Gaza is like just gone, right? And that produces a whole new level of social complexity that has to be sort of managed elsewhere. Savi's got a comment, which I'm going to read out. That's right. Here in Brazil, agribusiness feeds the world, and we run out of nitrogen in the soil and potassium and phosphorus too. So agribusiness injects NPK into the soil, increasing the cost of food production and addicting the soil, which cannot sustain itself without NPK in a short period of time. The soil was agroforested by indigenous communities for thousands of years and is now, for the most part, in the hands of agribusiness. It's pesticides and inorganic fertilizers. We already know who pays the price. Yes, this is exactly it, right? Like, this is like an incredibly good encapsulation of that process. Maybe it seems quite kind of mundane in some ways to talk about food, but it really, really, really is like the central affordance of the modern world. Like nothing functions without food, very obviously. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Savi. That's further corroboration of my theory, which I always love to receive. The example I was going to give is Sri Lanka. In 2022, undergoes a sort of a localized state failure. Very broadly, the same kind of things happen. There are pathological institutions, for example, the state, right, which makes these very strange lurches in the ways in which it organizes food production again, decides to shift everyone to organic agriculture, or announces that it will overnight. This causes massive chaotic things. But then the invasion of Ukraine happens, right? And it turns out that Sri Lanka is already dependent on international natural gas flows, which are then disrupted for use in fertilizer, right? And so you get these kind of like strange, complicated ways in which Sri Lanka becomes dependent on those global flows. As soon as those global flows are taken out of it for totally unrelated reasons. Right? Sri Lanka has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. Right? There's no connection. But the fact that it happens means that Sri Lanka is sort of suddenly in the lurch. It runs out of currency. It runs out of everything, and so it becomes this sort of self-escalating spiral. We talked about this before in the last session as well, but the other thing that's interesting about this is that this collapse is sort of hyperstitional collapse. Hyperstition is the idea that through the production of a sort of model of a phenomena, or sort of the conjuring of a kind of a I suddenly feel like I'm not going to be able to explain hyperstition in a way that's going to satisfy the accelerationists in the room. But like hyperstition is a process of the sort of it's beyond superstition, right? It's a kind of a thing that conjures the reality that it predicts. And we can think about financial markets as having done that in this particular case. So Sri Lanka's economy collapses because the financial modeling says that Sri Lanka's economy will collapse. The modeling says it will collapse, and therefore everyone pulls out their money, therefore it enters into a debt crisis. But it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't modeled that it would collapse. And so it's dependent on the modeling itself for it to collapse. And so the modeling becomes self-reinforcing. Right? That's one of the kind of perversities or complexities of this kind of way of thinking about it. So I said all that before. Now I've elaborated what the theory is a bit. We can arrive at the present day. We can arrive at this seminar. People like a very short break. Yes. Yes. Diana, great. Yeah, so Diana's written a really good comment here, which is displacement in the theory seems to echo the language of externalities and internalities, as in Jason Moore, in capitalist production. I was also thinking about displacement in time too, living on borrowed time through extraction instead of sustainability in agriculture. This is great. Yeah, this is exactly it. So like the displacement happens in this sort of both these two dimensions. One is this kind of projection outside into a sort of a world beyond that we don't try and think about, and we certainly don't pay for. And also at the same time, a world beyond, into the future, which then is mediated through a collection of sort of financial infrastructure that allows us to make bets on what that future will be like without actually paying for the cost of it. This is a very a really important kind of area. Let's take a short break, 5 minutes, and then we'll come back. That was probably, depending on whether or not you took the last course, that was probably not enough to digest or too much to digest. So I will see you in 5 minutes. So what we were doing there, for people who are watching later, is we were talking through Polis. Agello and Diana both added things that we talked about, and then we'll now sort of go on with the rest of the seminar. So yeah, supply chain fragility, that I wrote that one. So I'm just going to say probably, but like again, with this kind of nuance that like actually supply chain fragility produces new supply chains, right, which are incrementally less fragile, right, or that mobilize that fragility in a new way. So that's a sort of a thing I can add. In fact, I already added it. We did that one earlier. Okay, good. So it's sort of working. We're getting 3 quite distinctive clusters. So the main statement in person group A is the priority of people concerned about collapse should be to strengthen existing institutions. That's one motive. That's one sort of cluster of belief here. Cluster B, the main thing they disagree about, sorry, the main thing they agree on is that the priority of people concerned about collapse should be developing new institutions that are more democratic. That's a rejection of the democratic process, or sorry, rejection of the idea that we should try and develop new institutions that are more democratic. That's what unifies cluster B. And cluster C are people who disagree with the statement rising authoritarianism erodes institutional resilience. That's the strongest disagreement on that side. Okay. Interesting. I would love to, well, I'd be interested to hear what people's thoughts are on that, because I feel like the other 2 groups probably agree with that statement. So what is the case for the disagreement that rising authoritarianism erodes institutional resilience? Or to put it in its positive form, rising authoritarianism is more robust, right? That's the sort of the claim there. Very interesting, very interesting. They also agree with this. They also think that declining biodiversity weakens food security. They also agree with renewable adoption, energy adoption. So they disagree that this is interesting, right? So now we have kind of like a very strange nuanced take, which is that on statement 1, Polis is breaking somehow. On statement 1, they agree that authoritarianism is robust, but disagree that that collapse justifies authoritarianism, right? So it's robust, but it's not justified. I think that's the kind of the nuanced position we're getting here. Okay, great. Let's go on with the seminar. So can you see my slides? Great. So a recent history of vulnerabilities. How do we get to the moment in which we are in? Right, this is the question. This is a historical question. And in doing so, we have to think about a whole collection of things that relate back to theory, but that test that theory out in various kind of forms. So I've subtitled this whole section of the seminar, the second section, the politics of a limitless risk. What does that mean? Well, the clearest or simplest version of this is that the limitless risk is simply that things get really, really bad, right? Or that there is there's a version of this in which the things that we care about no longer are achievable. And so there's sort of a risk not only to ourselves, but to the things we care about, which includes ourselves. And those things mean that we, eventually we can no longer sort of make any progress on those things. They are ruined, they're wasted, and so on. but it's also a sort of a more kind of underlying or like philosophical or sort of more profound kind of transformation, which I mean by limitless risk, which is that limitless risk undercuts the question of value. It makes us question how or what we can care about, or whether or not we can care about things at all, right? Or whether or not we should give ourselves up to some sort of machinic process or some sort of like process of sort of collapse without limit. And we'll talk about that as a strategy next time in the second section of the seminar, which is about set a text called On Letting Go by Aaron Crawford, where he draws on ideas from Buddhism and from accelerationism to try and kind of advocate for a position of resignation, right? And this question of the end of value is the question of like the end of politics, really. And so the politics of the end of politics is what we're talking about here. The politics of the point at which you can no longer coherently care about things in the world, right? The politics of limitless risk. All right, so let's talk about history. I'm going to start with the sort of the moment that in some ways like defines the contemporary world more than any other, which is simply the largest transition that global system has had in the last sort of 50 years, right? Which is the end of the Soviet Union. Why is this so important? Because it depolarizes the world. It means that we no longer have this sort of like, you know, extremely clear, you are for the West or you're for communism, right? You no longer have this sort of bipolar world. And then of course there are the non-aligned movements and all the kind of complexities that come with that. But there is also this kind of sense that much of global politics exists in orientation to these two different poles. A huge number of the movements that took place in, say, Africa, in the wave of decolonization or anti-imperialist movements, explicitly framed themselves as communist movements. They got support from the Soviet Union in lots of cases. Lots of them were sustained by Soviet Union backing. And then, of course, the other things that were sort of anti-communist were also sustained by the Americans, right? and by Europe. And so you get this sort of, even in places where there isn't a clearly defined kind of orientation towards this kind of bipolar world, there is still a sense that there is the stakes of politics are sort of defined for you, right? But there's kind of an orientation in the world that supersedes all others. So why did the Soviet Union collapse? I'm sure people have thoughts about this. Genuine question, people. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Please.
Yeah, but is it collapsed really now? Because I have to say, I mean, I'm from Ukraine, yeah, but I was born in 1989, so I don't remember really Soviet Union. But I would say that the current war, Russian war against Ukraine and other countries, I mean, Georgia and so on, it's a desire to restore basically the Soviet Union because they believe it was the biggest empire, and so it wasn't collapsed really, you know. It's really important because all the post-Soviet countries are still going through this kind of decolonization, let's say. But at the same time, the question was why it's collapsed, yeah? Well, I think that because of the hypocrisy, really, the system became so fragile because the one which they declared, they could not really support, the system wouldn't support anymore. And I think this is what happens currently with the capitalism also.
Interesting. Yes. Okay, great. So point about the question of whether or not the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, very, very important. I would say that if we limit it to the question of why did the Soviet government fall apart, then we can say that it collapsed, I think, pretty unequivocally. The question of whether or not the geopolitical interests that are expressed in Russian imperialism collapsed, I think is much more complicated, and I think probably the answer is no, right? And so, but in some ways, that's the thing you can think about happening before the Soviet Union as well, right? There is this vast economy, this obviously vast country that exists, and in this ambivalent and often kind of contested position with relationship to Europe, to its west, right? And that's looked upon as a sort of threatening, often quite Russophobic philosophy looked upon as sort of threatening thing from the 17th century onwards. Right, the idea that Russia sort of represents this kind of this unknowable thing, sort of over to the, and then it has sort of imperial designs upon Europe or upon its sort of surrounding nations. That's a centuries long, right, like question, a centuries long process, and then it takes a particular form perhaps in the Soviet Union, and then takes a new form with contemporary Russian imperialism, right, under Putin and so on. So I think we can talk about sort of stages of a sort of an overarching project there. But the Soviet Union as a political structure that proclaimed its allegiance to communism, right? That had a particular governmental structure, that had a particular way of organizing production and so on. These things, I think, definitely did fall apart, right? Whether or not the underlying imperial ambition changed, I think, is a much more complicated question. And so lots of theories have been put about, lots of theories have been suggested for why it is the Soviet Union fell apart. Perhaps the main one here is that it relied increasingly on foreign oil reserves, right? So Russian agriculture, Soviet agriculture was very inefficient by and large. It relied on foreign currency to buy things from outside the country. And then the way it got that foreign currency is by selling oil. In 1986, after the oil price spike of the 1970s, which leads to the 3-day week in the UK and so on, we get a transition where we have the oil price collapses, that removes the reserves from the Russian state, and of course those reserves are being used to prop up the Soviet economy, which is increasingly inefficient and increasingly unable to meet its demands, the demands of its populace, right? Who are in this moment as well increasingly aware of the West, increasingly aware of the kind of style of life that the West represents. And so there is a sort of an internal movement for democratic process inside the Soviet Union that then meets this like immovable force, which is the Soviet sort of intransigence in relation to that demand. At the same time, in the 80s, partly as a way of like reorganizing production, you get these enormous military budgets. I've seen some estimates. We don't know exactly the numbers because it's shrouded in secrecy, but I've seen estimates that think like 25% of the Soviet economy it goes towards the reproduction of the military. And so we get these two processes, glasnost, perestroika, which are transparency and restructuring in English by Gorbachev and so on. These processes then sort of lead to a process to the undercutting of the Soviet Union and its ultimate demise as people become more able to see what is going on outside them, outside the world. They start to like it, and then perestroika means that the Soviet economy is increasingly decentralized or sort of not any more organized around the centralized structure, and that leads to a greater degree of sort of autonomy inside the society. Senza.
Yes, so I'm thinking about this question because I think it's really funny. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? And I went back to, well, a couple of months ago, I tried to delve myself into this whole um, anarcho-libertarian economical policies or theories, um, rather out of curiosity. This will be the first time that I try to explore or read those sort of things without necessarily having university infused ideological bias towards reading it and immediately saying, oh, they are cis white males who don't know shit about the world. And that's incorrect. I mean, that's naive, you know? So when reading these things, they ongoingly go back to this question: why did the Soviet Union fail? It's actually an ongoing conversation among circles of people who are keen to the theories of the Chicago School or the Austrian School, going back to these authors like von Mises or Rothbard or Milton Friedman, even, who is like a dumbass. And it's the fact that there is an economical factor within it that despite its vastness, as you mentioned, it was a pretty vast land. It didn't show to be effective at an agricultural plane, economically speaking. Because they tend to emphasize the huge indicator of hunger within poor populations residing on the Soviet Union land, in contrast with the rising wonderful economic policies post New Deal, mostly implemented by the US or some countries from the Schengen states. Uh, that is an economic reason that it's usually dived into by people familiar with these sort of economic theories or ideologies. And at a personal level, thinking about even the responses that we were doing with this small thingy from Polis, um, is that precisely it went down because the Soviet Union wasn't looking to go into the wasn't looking to set upon itself in history as an empire, and that's why it failed, because it refused the necessary authoritarianism to partake within collapse and outside of it that most of robust institutions have. Like they are looking to get imperial to overcome these sort of processes in history. And I think that the Soviet Union didn't look for that, since it didn't thought of itself as an imperial institutional exercise. It was rather the opposite, right? Like they didn't want to be an empire.
So
They
certainly,
didn't care about the West.
well, I mean, so clearly I mean, the Soviet Union claimed that it was an anti-imperialist force. Yes, I wonder if, I mean, like there are lots of examples of imperialism in the Soviet Union. Like there is very, there's the Holodomor in Ukraine, which induced famine. There is the invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s, which is also leads to this sort of like hypertrophying of the budget. There are, there are, I think there are. Let me get, so is the claim here that because it lacked a process of expansion or a particular dynamic of expansion, that it wasn't able to draw, like, to preserve these sort of like hinterlands or these processes of accommodation, or sorry, appropriation, rather than, and that led to its downfall. I'm not quite sure I understand the argument.
Yeah, I mean, was just thinking like, from these economical perspectives on rather deterministic schools from the US or Europe, like the Austrian school and the Chicago school, they tend to see this in trying to go for the unbiased route. Under that justification, they go for this economic argument that despite its vastness, economically, the Soviet Union didn't show to be effective as a good proof or reference worldwide, participating on the whole globalist concession. And politically, I was thinking, well, we could also play devil's advocate here and go for another route. Maybe the Soviet Union is an empire, and the proof that is an empire is the existence of Russia. Just like if we ask, has the Persian Empire disappeared in spite of Iran's existence, geopolitically speaking? Like we could say that these empires haven't disappeared, but rather focus their authoritarianist wings onto the idea of the nation state, of a specific nation states. So in that sense, I will agree with you. Like maybe it is rather an actually existent imperial exercise within history itself, because Russia exists and invades Ukraine, which is like really weird. Thinking about it, thinking about this retrospectively,
Okay, yeah, I think so. This is the subject of the rest of the lecture. Really, is the question of like how we move from an orientation around a bipolar world in which communism and capitalism become the two dominant forms, to an orientation that is around nationalism and the way in which that sort of is an adaptive response in some ways to the process of collapse. Right. So I think we'll talk about that. I mean, like. Joao's just written, Amin wrote, I had a very similar thoughts about the script, describing it as an autophagic process as well, right? A process of self-consumption. Do you want to elaborate on that, Amin?
Yeah, I guess aligned with the general consensus here, that didn't really collapse, but rather got disseminated, remained in the machine unconscious, allowing it to preserve the identity, at least, if not expressed symptomatically on um, social or geopolitical or economic scales.
Yeah, yeah. And Diana wrote, I remember hearing, was Richard Wolff, I think it was, that the Soviet Union was more probably a form of state capitalism rather than a communist society. It was a failed communist revolution in a way. And then economic warfare led by the US had a large role in downfall. Yeah, it did. Yeah, but also it was a yes. I think these are also very important parts of it. One very striking feature of it was that it was a surprise to the Americans. They didn't realize how close it was to collapse. Right? It was the CIA has a report from like 1986, something like that, where it's like it's going to go on forever. And then, like, 3 years later, it's fallen apart. Joao writes, maybe their state capitalism could not properly manage highly complex production chains and just-in-time production, as has collapsed is contemporary with the rise of Asia. That's a very good point. Yeah. So that there's a question about like the centralization of this particular thing. I think this is what Senza was talking about as well. Like the centralization of the determinate, like deciding what happens in production, means that it's unable to integrate information effectively. This harks back to what's called the socialist calculation debate, which is a debate between economists about exactly this question of whether or not a socialist or state-oriented process can ever integrate enough information in order to effectively make decisions about what should be produced. And the answer from history seems to be not great. We'll go into the Chinese case in a section, which is which is a very novel form of state capitalism, right? And whose collapse is often foretold, right, and doesn't seem to happen. So there are lots of complications here about the rise of China. And then we have this finally on the slide, the question that Dario was raising, right? Is it a collapse, right, or is it simply a new institutional composition, right? That we can talk about having sort of great deal of continuities between two different parts. So the question for me really here, sort of academically, is like, well, we've got this theory of compression, of displacement, of complexification. Does it make sense? Like, does it fit the model? Does the data fit the model? And I think in a sense it does, right? Because we could talk about the kind of compression of the overarching Soviet economy into a singular institution of the Soviet government, which then tries to dominate that process and tries to organize that process centrally. That fails. We can talk about displacement or dependency, whereby the oil economy of Russia or the Soviet Union becomes incredibly important to it. And then when those external conditions change, it undergoes a sort of process of destruction. And then we can talk about complexification in the form of an ideological complexification, in which people no longer, if they ever really did, believe in communism in a kind of like definite way, and instead start to believe in much more complex, heterogeneous things and so on. People should read Svetlana Alexievich on this, and also things like Alexei Yurchak, who have both written very good books about the feeling of these last moments of the feeling of suddenly exiting the grand enclosure of communism, right? And what that does psychologically to people. Very interesting books. Alexei Yurchak's book is called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. I think it's a great title and like really encapsulates this sort of feeling of immense stasis and then sudden breakage, and then like it's over. What now? And then of course, the sort of the more kind of complicated question that I think we can ask is like, well, how does this collapse of the Soviet Union set us up for a new risk landscape? How do we move from the end of the Soviet Union towards something that is looking increasingly fragile, like Dario mentioned, right? Like a process whereby people lose hope or faith in the possibility of communism, and then begin to, over the course of the next 30 years, lose hope and faith in the prospects of capitalism. Right? This is the kind of the question we're asking. And so I'm going to try and tell the story. We're not going to have a break, because I put the slide at the wrong moment, but the question that underlying this is like, does the theory work, right? So my claim is that it works, but it's very abstract, right? In order to express what actually happens in a particular case, you have to like dive down a very long way from super abstract concept of organizational society. And therefore there's this other question that I asked at the very beginning was like, well, what work is the theory doing then? If you have to like always go to the specifics, what explanatory quality does it have? Can it be falsified? You know, these are the questions you should ask about a theory, and this is no different. This is the claim I want to make, that we move from the collapse of the Soviet Union to another threat of a collection of threats, right? And this process is kind of coherently tellable as a set of consequences of the decline of the Soviet Union. So the response of one period of collapse sets the conditions for the following period of collapse. We talked about one of these in the last, I want to say episode, but last series, where we talked about the mass murder of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, right? What that does is that causes them to stop managing the landscape in the way they had been doing before, because lots of them are dead. This causes tree grow back. So trees grow back over the Americas, in particular in Central America or Mesoamerica. That causes global carbon dioxide levels to decrease. Like it's the opposite process of what's happening now. That causes global cooling, and global cooling affects crop yields in China, across Europe, and so on. And then you get this wave of revolution, this wave of collapses that happen as a result of that. And so we have this sort of, think about Marx's C prime or MC M prime formula, right? So you get money, commodities, money, more money, and that process of capitalism. We can think about in the same way. We can think about a sort of a collapse, institutional mediation, further collapse, right? They operate in cycles. What happens concretely in this particular case is that the ascendancy of American hyperpower, that is uncontested global power, removes the constraints of multipolarity from its actions. The obvious example here is the invasion of Iraq, right, which is done illegally, without any kind of like, I mean, there is a UN resolution, but it doesn't actually license the invasion. And then there is a, you know, and this sort of breaks the process of multilateralism, multipolarity, and so on. In the same way, what China does in response to the Soviet collapse is revolutionize its industrial processes, right? So it's not long after the collapse of the Soviet Union that we get Deng Southern Tour. This is Deng Xiaoping, who's the central figure of this sort of the transition from a sort of Maoist state into a sort of the capitalist state we know today. He goes on what's called the Southern Tour, and he makes this series of remarks and series of propositions in 1992, so just a year after the full collapse, makes a series of remarks that leads to the liberalization of the Chinese economy, and then the rapid transformation of China into a capitalist state, right? And that's the sort of the dynamism that we see from China today is set in that kind of particular moment. All of the beginning, it starts to rapidly increase. And so America adapts by expressing its power in new, untrammeled ways. China acts by adopting its economy away from the kind of thing that we have in the Soviet Union and towards a much more sort of weakly state-directed form of capitalism. And then crucially, of course, I'm going to talk about this later, doesn't do the kinds of transparency, doesn't do glasnost, right? It does perestroika, which is the restructuring in a sense, but doesn't do glasnost, doesn't do transparency, doesn't do openness, because the way it diagnoses the problem of the Soviet Union's collapse. And that leads to the simultaneous American hyperpower and rise of China leads to situations in which we now have both climate change and AI as very serious risks. Clearly, the humiliation of Russia through privatization in the end of the Soviet Union puts nuclear war over the long term back on the table. Right, so we seem to have left the nuclear war and its threat in the Cold War, but in fact, with the war in Ukraine, right, it becomes much more substantial threat again. In partly because NATO expansion threatens to expand, and this leads to a backlash in Russia, and then Russian ultranationalism becomes this sort of autonomous force that leads to the war in Ukraine. Right, this is a sort of way of phrasing the kind of the dynamics of humiliation and retrenchment and nationalism that we think about today. This is what I'm trying to explain. Can we think about this in sort of collapse, composition, collapse cycle? So, in the American hyperpower period, we get the exorbitant, we get an intensification of the exorbitant privilege of the dollar regime. People know what the dollar regime is. The dollar regime is the way in which international trade is conducted. So if I want to, lots of international trade is mediated in dollars. So not trade with America necessarily, but trade between two non-American countries will nevertheless be mediated in dollars. They control a thing called SWIFT, which is the international payment structure. But also the dollarization is a sort of major aspect of the ways in which the international oil markets work. So oil trade happens in dollars. There have been attempts to move away from this. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have tried to have a sort of propose at various moments to have sort of a BRICS currency they could use to trade amongst themselves. Hasn't happened. Probably won't happen. But what does this allow America to do? Well, part of what it allows America to do is to keep interest rates low. And this sounds like super technical and like kind of irrelevant to the questions at hand, right? It's not obvious why that would lead to collapse risk. But what it does is allows America to keep interest rates low because people want to buy the dollar, because they will need to do international trade in the dollar. And what that means is that the interest rates can be kept low, and that means that American consumers can buy houses at significantly reduced interest rates. That means that we get a collection of consumerist, sort of consumerist lifestyle in the 1990s and 2010s, and also a mass glut of house price buying. This is of house buying. Houses can be purchased on much less money than they could be in other countries because the interest rate is low and therefore mortgages are cheap. What does this lead to? Well, in the long run, it leads to the 2008 crisis. When you get sudden waves of defaults, as the interest rate changes and goes up, people start to default on their houses. People are immiserated. They lose a lot of money. They lose their houses they had previously relied on as support and ways of life. What is the single determining fact of voting for Donald Trump in the 2016 election? What is the single fact that explains it to a highest degree? It is if you or you knew someone who defaulted on their mortgage in the 2008 crisis, right? That is the single explanatory fact. I mean, there are loads more complicated things, obviously, but like that is the single data point people have found that like really explains it. If you give people lots of money, get them addicted to that process of consumerization, and then withdraw it very suddenly, they get really upset. China adopts its partial liberalization, turns to developmentalism instead of communism as a sort of an ideology. And then what these two things together do, so on the one hand, the consumerization of America, so America stops being the main industrial producer of the world. It stops being the place where almost all not almost all, like a very large amount of manufacturing happens, and it starts moving to China because dollar dominance means that American exports are expensive. You don't want to buy things from the Americans because the dollar is expensive because everyone wants the dollar. So demand for the dollar goes up. That means that American exports are expensive. Imports to America are very cheap, and therefore we move the production on a global scale moves from America to China. And China is very happy to have this because it means they control the manufacturing process of everything. They're able to do this because they have a large number of people who, like Jason Moore points out in his sort of article on frontiers and cheap nature, a large number of people who can be integrated into the capitalist process at a sort of single leap, right? So we get what's called the Great Doubling. The Great Doubling is the process whereby over the course of the 80s to the present day, the number of workers available to capitalism doubles. And that means that that labor costs go down, people become poorer. That's also a feature of this. Individual people become poorer, but people can have cheap goods. So you less money, cheap goods, right? And that's the dynamic that is set up between China and America. This leads to vast trade deficits. And then you get the sort of Trumpian response to this, which is to do protectionism. Probably a bad idea, but nevertheless, this is strategy. The other thing that happens in this era is that we get failed states. Now, failed states are, as a paradigm, states have failed before, right? I'm not saying that begins to happen in the 90s. What happens is that we get a particular paradigm of what a failed state looks like that emerged in the 1990s. Somalia, again, is the sort of the test case for this, and I'll talk about the Somali collapse in a second. The reason why states fail in these cascades is complicated. However, one major thing we can say about it is that a lot of these states sort of depolarize or demagnetize. I think about it as a kind of a magnet, right? So you have like, you know, electromagnet or something, where you have like all the bits of the magnet are polarized in one direction, and you have either a American-backed government, or you have a Soviet-backed government, and you have American-backed insurgents, or you have Soviet-backed insurgents, right? That polarize around these particular kind of orientations. When the Soviet Union disappears and America stops funding its governments that it's been funding because it doesn't need to wage anti-communism or do global anti-communism anymore, things scatter. And because they scatter, they fall apart, right? And so you get this wave of state failure that happens because they are no longer backed by or supported by international aid in the form of both military support and also ideological support, right? And so as the Soviet Union falls apart, it triggers a whole wave of a cascade of state failures. I don't really have time to talk about it, but thinning associationism basically means that, like, one consequence of this in America in particular is that we get the paradigm of what's called bowling, not of failed states, but of the consumerization, which is that we get the paradigm of what's called bowling alone. People have read this book? So the book basically says there's this massive rise in the number of people who are going bowling. It's quite fun, but going bowling without friends. And in part, the reason for this, my claims, and part of the reason for this is that the American economy at this period is so awash in cash that unions and forms of collective organization, so churches, unions, civic organizations, and so on, start to degrade in power. Unionization rates fall. And the reason why they can fall is because why would you bother campaigning for higher wages when there's always cheap credit? So you can just like use a credit card. And so unionization is intimately connected to this process. And what unionization means, or deunionization, so the process of falling apart of unions means, is that we dissolve the structures of civic society and you end up with this sort of atomized mass of people who are sort of singular and alone and so on. This happens in a sort of a weird, we return in a sort of weird way to mass association through the internet and so on. If you want to hear more about this, subscribe to my blog. You know, I'm going to write an essay about it. The other thing that happens is that we enter the end of history, right? So proclaimed by Francis Fukuyama famously, and we get in this what we might think of as hyper agency on the one hand, and the crisis of future orientation on the other. So the Soviet Union leads the disencapsulation of social complexities. That's a very abstract way of saying that states fall apart because they can no longer be justified by the ideology of communism. This happens most obviously in Yugoslavia, right, where you get a suddenly decomposing society that is stitched together, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Kosovans, and so on, Macedonians, right, into one sort of single polity. As that process disappears, as the electromagnet falls apart, people depolarize, and we get the kind of obscene violence, nationalization, national struggle that you see in the former Yugoslavia. Right, this is something covered by Alain Hocker in his book Empire Disorder, which I probably should have put on the reading, but I forgot. So sorry. However, the real move is towards this kind of humanitarian outlook. Right, we now think about the world in sort of like terms of state capacity because there is no longer a sort of driving ideology that separates the world into this is the communist bloc, this is the capitalist bloc, and so on. Everything sort of becomes the same kind of thing. Everything becomes some sort of species of managerialism. And so we can say, well, all the states are kind of like fragile in the same kind of way. I want to think about, oh, and then as you can see, the most fragile state here is Somalia. This is from 2023, right? So you can see, Ukraine here has been invaded, it's fragile. Afghanistan is now under the rule of the Taliban again. Syria, this is before the recent change, so it's still, it's still clearly very, very fragile. But that's there. Yemen, Sudan, South Sudan, a whole bunch of Central African countries, the Congo, and so on. And then, of course, you get the ones that are sort of most stable, as everyone knows, Iceland, so on. Iceland's very stable, very nice. Go to Iceland.
Does green means stability?
Yeah. So green, dark green means stability. So it's kind of places you would expect. Like it's not. None of this is particularly surprising, I don't think.
It's just that it seems funny to me to see a place like Argentina, who is like ongoingly fucked up over the last 4 years in particular,
Right.
to be in that green zone. Like it almost baffles me that people think that it's as stable as the U.S. Like for real. Like, because it isn't.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's interesting here is that like the US is not that stable.
Precisely. Why the fuck is it light green? Like it's a really nice color.
Well, it might be a different color now. This was a couple of years ago. We might be in our stage of rapid decomposition.
But I mean, yeah, but yes, I agree. But Italy is also in this kind of state, right? Italy is not a country on the verge of collapse.
But it's a country in a dominant geopolitical cone, so it makes sense that it has stability. But like the thing about seeing the same color between Argentina and the U.S., it's crazy, like for real. Like Argentina is just as weak as the place where I live at, which is fucked up. So
where do you live?
Yeah, it is this. If not more, like Argentina, I think it's even more unstable. That's why I was thinking about this index from the year it was, because if it is from 2022, from 2022, it is, in my opinion, objectively incorrect.
About Argentina.
About Argentina specifically, yeah. No way that Argentina over the last 4 years has been as stable as the fucking U.S.
Yeah. Daria.
Yeah, no, I don't want to take time, but I mean, about the end of the history, I was just thinking, how come that this the concept was formed? Yeah, so it was after the collapse of Soviet Union, but at the same time, what about this? I mean, Europe or American-centric vision of the world that, yeah, basically, I mean, how come that there was no vision of issues around the globe or beyond these narrow thinking? And this kind of crisis of future orientation, this is what interesting, yeah, because we are now also in another kind of crisis of vision of the future. So, I mean, if you can maybe give some thoughts about that past, how the concept appeared back then.
Oh yeah, I'm not a Fukuyamian. I don't think history ended, obviously. That seems obvious to me. Yeah, no, I think that's a bad framework, and I think it is incredibly US centric as well. But in some ways, like the 1990s is quite US centric in a sense. Like it's the era of American hyperpower. Of course, something is happening in everywhere all the time, but there is also the sense that there really is a sort of predominance of America as a kind of a geopolitical force. Maybe I misunderstood your question.
No, I'm just thinking how, in general, those kind of ideas appeared. I mean, I believe that it's a good thing. It's hyper agency, and basically this, yeah, when we put the human being in the center of the world, and then like like maybe US supremacy is also going from this kind of ego again and again. So, and this is somehow what we have today too.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, my telling of the story is partly a way of thinking about how does that period of hyperagency undercut itself? How does the human centrism and American centrism of it fall apart over the long run? I think on the thing you mentioned at the end there before about the crisis of future orientation, right? Like this is the topic of the third seminar. So we're going to be talking about that hopefully at great length. I think it's really the most striking sort of malaise really of the present day. I think that there is it's impossible to imagine any kind of future really. Like things will happen, sure, but we have no idea what they are. And the lack of a sort of an overarching cohesive sense of what it is that the future entails for us, I think is really striking. There is of course technology, right, which forms a kind of ideology of the future itself. But yeah, that's I was quite disappointed by ChatGPT 5, you know, so I guess the future is cancelled again. Benjamin Gomes says, oh, sorry, Joel says, China in yellow is also strange. I think, so again, let me give my best case for that, right? So I agree with you. I think it is strange that the assertions of China's weakness have often been wrong, very often been wrong. I would say it's at least as stable as Russia is, if not significantly more stable. I'd probably put it, oh no, sorry, it is on this map more stable than Russia. I put it at least the stability of the UK. My best case would be for that. It would be that there are deep internal problems in China. The entirety of the West forms autonomous regions that like do not easily subject themselves to the domination of the East and the Han sort of supremacy that you get in China increasingly, as a justification, I should say again, for the lack of confidence in sort of Han supremacy becomes a replacement for communism as an ideology. So I think that's probably the best case that I could give for it. There are also other things like just levels of pollution are quite bad. But yeah, I would say that it's not supposed to be yellow. That is a misunderstanding, I think, of China. Senza says Eric Hobsbawm for the win. I can't remember what that's about. I think it's about the end of history, but yes, sure. Benjamin says Fukuyama's End of History is a watered-down version of Koyebe. And personally, the most productive engagement with this is Baudrillard's work and the passing over into hyperreality. I sort of agree. Maybe I'm too sober and like too English in some ways to like really go like lean into Baudrillard. But maybe you could elaborate on what you mean by that.
No, it's just that in Kojev, the end of history is a problem of discourse, and the end of discourse is the production of new knowledge in a way. So, and then for Baudrillard, that's what we live in. I think after what he usually sets the date around 68 and the May Revolution in France. It's just that
but like things happen after 68.
Yes, but for Baudrillard, they always happen relating. So things get constructed discursively as models, and then these models infiltrate reality. And everything that happens relating to a model of itself and not in itself.
Yeah, I mean, and the other big sort of struggle here is, of course, the totally different register, right? It's the struggle against Hegel, right? And this is still the struggle that I am trying to engage with in this course, right? Like the whole discourse of collapsology is somehow an attempt to get out of the Hegel trap, and obviously Koyeva has lots of thoughts about that as well. Yes, the question of the sort of self-relating model, I think, is very interesting. And maybe we could say that the problem of collapsology at a very abstract level is to try and think the new, but think the new not in the apocalyptic terms, right, that Baudrillard would say is still a sort of repetition of the kind of the wish for an end or something, right? But try and think the new in its like imminence to the social process, but also in a way that like really genuinely exits that the sort of the container that the end of discourse instantiates. I'm sort of riffing here. So if anyone wants to come in, I'd welcome that. It's an important thought, and we will come back to it. But first of all, we're going to go to Somalia. So, you know, the history doesn't end, right? It just has like bad kind of endings, right? Or it has like momentary collapses. So this is a very sketch history of Somalia as a collapse. The reason why I'm bringing it up and the reason why I'm talking about it is because in some ways Somalia, as in the 1990s, early 1990s in particular, becomes like the example of a failed state. It's kind of, it's a thing where like the state like really fully disappears and falls apart. And I wanted to complicate that by using some of the more sort of sophisticated humanitarian literature. Because when we think about collapse, not necessarily in its sort of Cold War era, that is the imaginary of the nuclear bomb and the end of the world and everyone dying simultaneously. But when we think about collapse in the more post-apocalyptic framework of you know, state dysfunction and disintegration and so on, mass death and so on, that becomes a Somalia emerges as the single sort of image of what that means, right? It means primal chaos and so on and so on. And this is, of course, like massively overcoded with both a complete failure to understand what Somalia is actually like, and also profoundly racist, like framing of sort of a African primitivism or something like this. Or yeah. Senza says, would you consider collapsology at the theoretical level as a study akin to the ones entailed by applied futurology, scenario design, game theory, predictive history? So those are definitely tools that we can use, but the aim of the project that I'm doing is mostly to try and exit the way in which reality becomes contained by its the modern forms of modeling that we've become used to, right? So scenario design, game theory, and predictive history are all forms of organization, right, of probabilities that sort of submit themselves to a kind of mathematical framework or a kind of a framework of abstraction and containment that allows you to deal with them as sort of distinct possibilities in the future. And in some ways, as I was saying to Benjamin, right, the question here is like, how do we think the new in a way that doesn't necessarily get encapsulated by an institution or sort of ideological institution in that kind of compressive framework, but that allows for quite like heretically new things to happen. I'm being very vague about this.
No, yeah, I get it. I get what you're trying to say. Not trying to go. It's an argument once again against this presentist notion of history, trying to make an effort beyond it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. How do we escape the trap not only of the kinds of world we live in, but also escape the trap of the ways in which we justify or explain those worlds to ourselves, but also escape the trap of the ways in which those worlds have been critiqued. The clearest one being Marxism, right? Marxism is a very long, and you can see that I'm sort of like still in that kind of Marxist kind of mode, right? Like I've referred to Marx like 4 or 5 times in this lecture, but the purpose of the theory that I'm trying to, the institutional theory, right, is that it's much more Foucauldian. It's much less Marxian. It's much more a sense of trying to escape or jump the trap of that way in which theory becomes sort of totalizing and says, well, now history demands this of us, or now history moves towards such a thing in this like grand dialectical process, right? And I'm trying to get out of that process while also maintaining the kinds of insights that I think are really invaluable from that theoretical framework, which are things like historical materialism, in which the questions that one can ask and answer and the kinds of lives one can live are themselves subject to a kind of historical process. Although in critical collapsology, it's not a collapse process that is dominated by the dialectical unfolding of a capitalist of class struggle, right, as it is for Marx, but a much more catastrophist view of what history entails, which is a turbulent process of temporary and fraught organization of the human world. This is the subject of the 4th seminar. So I'm going to displace all questions onto on that one, which is called something like the medium of history and the design of institutions, right? Where I'll get back to that. Somalia. So here we have a process that is like quite recognizable in some ways in theoretical conceit that I've constructed here. Cash crops, livestock markets, and so on. These tie Somalia into a sort of volatile price system. There is this overarching support that is given to the administration by the Soviet Union and so on, right? And then in the 1980s, structural adjustment programs, a whole bunch of things happen that I don't have time to go into because I've only got 20 minutes left. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to rush through this. The point is that I think it's expressible in terms of that institutional complexity argument, in that there is homogenization through a process of authoritarian centralization, but that produces its own kind of brittleness, and that produces a sort of a process of decomposition in the long run, right? In the outcome. However, we should complexify this theory, right? We should say that instead of there being this sort of states that are either failing or surviving, we should acknowledge that there is a sort of internal economy to collapse itself. And this is where diving into the sort of real specifics here becomes very useful. David Keane wrote an excellent book called Complex Emergencies that deals with the ways in which forms of sustained war and sustained conflict are not failure modes for states, but often the ways that those states actually supply and reinforce themselves. It's a really excellent book. Really recommend people checking it out because it goes into the ways in which there is not just a kind of a disaster without distinction or sort of a mass social disaster, but actually a system of production that gets sort of instantiated in these things that we think of as of collapse, and that actually leads to their sustainment. So there are examples that he uses, I think, from Sudan, where supposed belligerents, people who are actually fighting each other, are collaborating, right? And they're collaborating to like organize the system of violence in such a way, not only that it doesn't affect them as the commanders, but also such that it maintains access to resources and to those kind of productive international flows of goods that they benefit from. The clearest example here is the Congo, right, which is sustained in a very long process of civil war through its the benefits that the commanders reap from those conflicts, right? War is profitable, collapse is profitable. Collapse is a process of organizing system production such that you no longer have to deal with international sort of norms and so on, but that you can derive profits from them nonetheless, right? That's the thing that the depolarization of the Cold War, I think, facilitates in a much clearer way, when there is no longer the need to say, oh, we are communists, or oh, we are anti-communists, right? That disappears, and then you get these much more sort of naked forms of need and demand that are put on these conflicts. At the same time, right, we can also talk about the Congo in another term, right, which is that it facilitates the cheap production of natural resources that then go into the laptops that we're all on this call on. Right? That's the sort of the way in which the metabolism again works at a particular level. We complexify the Congo such that it produces a kind of a market for the production of goods, which then facilitates the global laptop class, of which you are all members, which I remember too. Okay. This is all very familiar, I think, right? I said lots of it before. So we get the war on terror, obviously, which expands American power worldwide. We know international norms, often a paltry sense of legality. Although interestingly, the neocons who institute the sort of the CIA black sites and so on are pretty keen that there is some sort of legal justification for this thing. They just don't know what it is, or like they say what it is, but you're not allowed to know. Or there's a whole complicated legal structure here that someone like Trevor Paglin, who's an exceptional artist but also a researcher, has done lots of really interesting work on. I've said all these things before. Why does dollar dominance undermine itself? So this is now the kind of the question where we think about like how the system of American hyperpower becomes over time to be more fraught. You can see here trade imbalances. Right? So trade imbalances for the US have become massive deficits. We're almost at $1 trillion of trade imbalances. There are roughly 400 million Americans. That means we're looking at, what is it, $2,000 per year per American of trade imbalance with the rest of the world. Is that right? Have I got my maths correct there? Yeah, something like that. Like $2,300, something like that, of payments that the America, things that America doesn't make itself, and that are imbalanced with the rest of the world. This week in US manufacturing, as we could talk about the rising authoritarianism in the US. Clearly, that's in part a result of the destruction of the US Rust Belt, or the construction of the US Rust Belt, rather, from its previous industrial heartlands and so on. This is some of the only places in America that I've been, and I was amazed at the extent of it. It was really astonishing. So another thing I might think about is the new technologies of war. Clearly, the Ukraine war has been a site of extraordinary innovation in the domain of warfighting. Drones have become like the new form of predominant power, although there are lots of artillery is also still very important. Why does this matter for our sort of overall scheme? Because concomitant with the rise of AI, right, and the rise of autonomous weapons, is this necessity of having production for these things on very short timeframes. As Ukraine is fighting Russia, both Ukraine and Russia have had to rapidly innovate in the field of drone technologies, because the both sides are changing how they work, right? So jammers that allow you to that prevent you from controlling the drone are a very important part of this. The solution there is to have a very long fiber optic cable that attaches the drone like physically to the thing. That restricts its movement. Lots of complexities there. And there's kind of escalating war, escalating sort of arms race inside the Ukraine war about this. This is unusual in a sense, right? This is not how, for example, America has fought most of its previous wars. Most wars in, for example, Pakistan, where the undeclared drone war happened, or Afghanistan or Iraq, have been counterinsurgencies. And there was this move around 2020, when the just before the US exited Afghanistan, a big move towards a different kind of war, which was peer competitor war, which is that instead of having sort of armored trucks and infantry who can fight in particular sort of locations, and special forces as the dominant way of American warfighting, they were going to move towards large platforms, because the preeminent the adversary they were thinking about was China. And China is a modern, sophisticated military with fighter jets and big ships and a huge shipbuilding capacity, and so on and so on and so on. What the invasion of Ukraine does is move the adversarial sort of like focus again towards not great powers like China, but towards middle powers like Russia, right? Who's don't have the capacity or don't have the willingness to have these really long time frames that it takes to make a new submarine, or like make a really advanced tank or something like that, and don't have the capacity to deploy them towards iterative warfighting, right? And this change produces a whole set of changes in the US industrial and military complex. So you get the rise of companies like Anduril. People heard of Anduril? So Anduril is a drone company that attempts to do drone manufacturing on software timelines. So hardware on software timelines. And we get this sort of whole move of the American industrial base, which increasingly is predominant around things like software, Silicon Valley and so on, moves towards the production of hardware as well, but on the timelines you would expect from software. So the organization of a supply chain that can deliver a new drone next week, rather than 5 submarines in 15 years' time, right? Which is what the paradigm of major platform development is, and so on. Yeah, Anduril. Yeah, it's a Peter Thiel backed thing whole interesting collection of things there. Why this matters is because one of the major risks people are worried about now is autonomous kill webs. An autonomous kill web is a kill web is the idea that there is a sort of it's an extrapolation from like the idea of a food chain, right, to a food web, in that things eat other things. There's much more sort of complexity to it, and a kill chain, which is basically the list of people who have to command. So the general says, go and kill people there, and the colonel says, go and kill people there, and so on and so on and so on, down to the person who's actually pulling the trigger. That's a kill chain. The kill web is a much more distributed collection of systems, including technical systems and particularly individuals who combine to produce the effect of killing the adversary, right? And so this is that's the paradigm. An autonomous kill web is a dynamic in which major decisions are made by systems, technological systems, right? And the reason why this is important and why this is kind of particular, this drone technology is a new kind of paradigm in warfighting is because it facilitates the arrival of autonomous kill webs, which gives the state much more power because it allows a large-scale war to happen without conscription. So one of the reasons why America can't like do unlimited war is because Americans don't want to go to war, right? Boots on the ground is a major sort of red line in America's kind of the American public and their opposition to war. We don't want boots on the ground. We can do air support and so on, but no boots on the ground. This facilitates exactly that happening, right? But nevertheless, major war fighting to happen at the same time. That's why I'm mentioning it. I think it's also a major collapse risk in a sense, right? Because it's because it allows the state to have military autonomy from its public. At some level, when you have people in the army, they can say no, but a drone can't say no, or an autonomous kill web can't say no. I have gone way over time here. I've got way too many things to talk to about. So I'm just going to tell you that China adapted to the Soviet Union by liberalizing its economy. This is what I framed earlier as Chinese perestroika without Chinese glasnost, right? So a process of restructuring the economy to liberalize and become the dominant manufacturing power in the world without actually at any point allowing people to talk about anything, right? This goes backwards and forwards. There was a period from 2004, 2014, where there was a progressive liberalization. Then you get the era of Xi Jinping, who deliberalizes China, becomes more restrictive again. These things go back and forth, but this is basically the tendency. And the reason why I'm bringing it up, in part, because it's the major story of like how a country that everyone thought was also going to collapse doesn't collapse. The other big communist country. Right, that's the story here. But also it's interesting because of the ways in which the Chinese explanation for the Soviet Union collapse changes over time. So at the beginning, the theory looks much more like the theory that I spelled out earlier. Complex institutional structures, energy prices, military overbuild, and so on. And then it becomes over time simplified and simplified and simplified and simplified until essentially the key idea is that the Soviet Union collapsed because, in the words of Xi Jinping, no one was man enough to keep it together. That is like, you know, Gorbachev wasn't like hardcore enough and didn't keep it together. Yeltsin wasn't hardcore enough and didn't keep it together. Right? This is the level of like the Chinese explanation, because, and in some ways, I think that's a way of, you know, it's a way of getting out of the trap of having to do the kinds of things that the failure of the Soviet Union demands of China, while saying instead, okay, no, we're actually going to centralize authority even further, because only when there are centralized and convinced authorities in the necessity of Chinese communism can China survive, right? So it becomes a sort of purely psychological explanation. It's a very interesting historiography. I've got a great article I can send people if they're interested, and how this process happened of the, you know, the complex systems becomes like, no, it was a ideological failure. It was an ideological thing. No time to talk about the next China. Spoiler, there isn't one. The UNFCCC, how do we end up with a situation where climate change can't be addressed? Here are 3 different explanations. You should screenshot this and go and find out which one you think is the most plausible. So, or four explanations rather. One is the explanation for geopolitics. It wasn't in the major countries' interests to fight climate change. B, transitions do not happen. Like there aren't energy transitions. It's just like it's an illusion. There are energy additions. We just end up using more and more and more. This is Jean-Baptiste Frézeau in More and More and More. Václav Smil, Bill Gates' favorite writer, is his explanation is that you can't transition from energy low density to high density. Sorry, high density to low density. That is, it's never been tried. We've always got more dense energy sources. So biomass and wood to coal to oil, oil to nuclear fission, right? These are all densifications. Never really been tried to go the other way. And then there's the Andreas Malm argument in Overshoot, which is that basically renewables are cheap, and that's the problem. Right? Because they are cheap, they're not profitable. It's much more nuanced than that. I don't have time to go into it. Why does this matter for our present? Well, obviously climate change matters, but like one question about why it matters is like, how does the balance of power work between different societies? Chinese manufacturing is now bigger than America's was in the 50s as a proportion of total manufacturing, right? So America was the workshop of the world. It was the place where almost everything was made in the 1950s. And now it's entirely shifted to China, or not entirely, but mostly shifted to China. And it uses vastly more energy than any other economy. So if you subscribe to the sort of the energy dominance theory of societies, then this is the major metric you should be looking at. American energy use declined as a proportion of total energy use from the 80s onwards, as shifted to a service economy. And then Chinese energy has been going up ever since, and it's still going up. And then has their own system, which prototypes things. And then America is the shale oil world's largest oil producer. The reason why this matters is because it's another, I think, stake in the heart of peak oil. It's another stake in the heart of this kind of notion that the central thing that matters is energy return, energy invested. This thing I mentioned earlier, the acronym EROI. Because shale oil is beneficial for the Americans because they control it. Right? It's about control rather than about energy efficiency. Right? And that's central dynamic that I think, again, Tainter misses. Because again, I think he has an overly aggregated theory of how societies work. A familiar graph. This looks like unmitigated failure. But it's actually, I don't think it is, because the world economy actually grows exponentially fast in this period. And so merely linear growth is actually not a mitigated failure, but complicated question. This graph at the top right is solar panel construction as a proportion. So China is over half of all the solar panel construction in the world. So an energy transition is happening. The question is whether or not it's merely addition or it can actually replace previous energy. And here is, as you can probably guess, a giant Chinese solar panel installation in the shape of a panda, because soft power is everywhere. All right, let's look at polis. How do people shake out? Like, where do we get to in our kind of overarching thing? Let me see if I can see the opinion groups. I can't see the opinion groups. Can everyone see the... Can you see on yours? Okay, here we go. So there is an A group and there is a B group, which contains 3 people, and an A group that contains 11 people. So I want to hear from the B group. I want to hear from B group. So let's find one of the controversial ones. Okay, this is the main system of disagreement here. So this is the main form of disagreement, right? I'm assuming. Who is in B group? Who answered yes to the priority of people concerned about collapse should be to accelerate collapse? So that's something new can be made. We've got our accelerationist, sort of like non-accelerationist kind of system here. There are 3 of you. Who are you? Amin? Great, good to know. Who else? Amin, tell us about why you asked this question this way.
I mean, yeah, I guess it goes back to what you initially said, that the modeling contingents itself on its own condition of emergence. So yeah, generative systems that allow for emergent behavior. So I'm all for synthetic evolution per se.
Synthetic evolution.
In loose terms, you know, transhumanist discourse and the kind.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Great. Let's see what unified Group A. So Group A is much larger and more complex in its disagreement. So let's see the thing that is like the most disagreeable. Okay. I'm trying to find the thing that is most fractious inside Group A. Okay, so this is the really interesting thing about this, right? Is that we can see that inside Group A, only 60% of people agreed that renewable energy adaptation decreases dependency on volatile fossil fuel markets. What were the reasons for that? Who answered? Who's in Group A, but answered no on that? Yeah, Benjamin.
Well, relating again to the peak oil thing,
Yeah.
and I don't really know, but the main guy who I read talking about fossil fuels is Jean-Michel Greer, and where it says that the problem is the whole infrastructure of producing energy is dependent on fossil fuels to make the machines to make renewable energy.
Yes. So I read Jean-Michel Greer's account of that. I think it's good. I would recommend that if you want another version of that, Jean-Baptiste Frézeau's More and More and More, also really good. Basically, like a much more sort of thoroughgoing account of exactly that process. Recommend that. What else was like controversial? Interesting. So okay, so they disagree with unlikely. So people in this group think it was likely. Nuclear weapons. Wow. Okay, so the other point of disagreement amongst people in Group B, that's people who, the sort of, I will say, accelerationist group, is that A, collapse is very unlikely, and B, that nuclear war is the main driver. Interesting. Very interesting. Great. Well, we will carry on with this throughout the rest of the seminar. You are free to, at any point, add new statements to this graph. You are welcome to change your statements. Go back in your own history if you can access that. You think you probably have to log in for that. You're welcome to add new statements. You're welcome to change statements. You're welcome to, nuance things, hash it out in the Discord. This is the end of the seminar, mostly for time reasons. My apologies for going so long. Does anyone have any burning questions, thoughts, disagreements, and so on? Does everyone have access to the Discord? Yeah, everyone's in the Discord? Yes, cool. Please debate the questions of the day in the Discord. You have assessments. If you're taking this class for credit, you have an assessment. We should yeah, so Dari's got a point here. Just a thought, in the context of the collapsology discussions of strategy, I believe we should use the word transformation rather than transition. If survival is our goal, it requires a change in values and interests, not merely a change in form, as it were, in the end of the 80s after 91. Agreed. Yes, good. That will be... So strategy towards collapse will be the main topic of our seminar next week. And the readings for that, you should have found. They will be sent around a... spreadsheet for you to fill in. Everyone must do one reading if you're doing this credit for the class for credit. You will present that credit, that text to the class. I will put in breaks inside the seminar that will allow people to do that. If you do not want to present publicly for any reason, then message me on Discord or email me, richard.hames@thenewcenter.org. That's fine. You can submit a presentation outside. You should do the reading. You should read all of the texts and present one of them at some point in the seminar. The topics of the next seminars are strategy, collapsology on the left, and then the medium of history and the design of institutions. And so it becomes more abstract as we go along. Again, having like been a bit more concrete today. And then, yeah, good, cool. Thank you for coming. I think I had something else to say. Oh yeah, you should also, if you're doing this for credit, you need to submit something at the end of the course. Think about what that is. It could be a strategy. It could be a project. It could be a text. It could be an artwork. It could be more or less anything you'd like. And the final thing to say is that for next week, we are going to be talking about this diagram, which is strategies towards, in, and through collapse. Here we have a very profound collapse, and the strategic adaptation is the construction of a knowledge arc, the maintenance of the arc in the early stages, protection of the arc, and an excavation of the knowledge after the collapse. For economic downturns, we have monitoring, emergency bailout measures, countercyclical spending, tapering down stimulus, right? It's a classic sort of like formulaic Keynesian response to economic collapse. You can add things, you can suggest things before the next class. If you think of strategies, if you come across something you think is an interesting strategy for dealing with collapse at any scale, add it. That's it.
Thank you, Richard. Just a quick note on the presentations requirement. I will be sending an email either today or tomorrow with the presentation sheet, with an Excel sheet, so that you can introduce your names. As Richard says, if you don't feel comfortable or just don't want to do a presentation in front of the class live, I will also make a folder available in the Google folder in the Google Drive so that you can upload a pre-recorded presentation. Just make sure that if you do get in touch with Richard about the presentation, that you also CC me so that I can also mark it as done. And my email will be also in the email that I will send you with the presentation sheets. That's it.
Sick. If you want to talk to me, ask me questions, then we will not do that here. Your questions are going to be great, so do message me, but do so on Discord or on email. I'm fast to reply on Discord, less fast on email. So depends how long the answer you want, I guess. Great. Thank you so much. Unless you've got a really burning question, I will see you next week.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you.
Thank you.
I will send around the slides, yes. I mean.